بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. There's a hadith that is narrated by the Imam al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala and his Sunan respectively, where the Prophet ﷺ was asked, Ayu du'a'i asma', which dua is heard, meaning which dua has a greater possibility of being heard and accepted by Allah Azza wa Jal. He said after that, Jawf al-layl al-akhir wa dubra salat al-maktubat, that in the midst of the night and directly after every fard salah. So in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ responded by saying that the dua that is heard the most by Allah Azza wa Jal is the dua that is done in the middle of the night and the dua that is done directly after every fard salah. This is an introduction because I was asked last time that we could speak a little bit about dua, and especially dua after salah and the adab and the etiquette of dua. And part of the question also was whether it is part of the etiquette of dua to do it in unison in jama'ah after salah also. So we'll try to maybe use the subject, but I also wanted to kind of open up a discussion about hadith. What are the significance of hadith, and even somewhat of an introduction to the science of hadith. And these are things that we should be aware of. That, of course, what's the importance of hadith in our deen, but also how we understand hadith in terms of coming to a conclusion and making rulings based on that. So to introduce the subject was probably more my intent than actually talk about the subject of dua after salah or the adab of dua, because again, all of this is based on hadith. And in order to understand why sometimes scholars have differences of opinion, it's important to understand why hadiths have different grid. They have a different type of status according to many different factors. So this hadith I just mentioned, of course, is clear in its meaning, that Prophet ﷺ was asked that what dua is heard the most by Allah, meaning which dua, obviously what's meant by that which dua does Allah hear and accept, and which he said, Jawf al-layl al-akhir, that in the middle of the night, and then after that, dubra salawat al-maktubat, which means that directly after every fard salah. Now, again, to go into maybe the other subject that I wanted to touch upon is the hadith itself. To understand its importance, I would like to maybe discuss some things about the actual science of hadith, and what is it, and how does it apply to us, and why is it important to understand the actual science of hadith and how it came to be, and in relation to what we know now of anything that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and in also understanding our differences of opinions. Because my belief is that if we understand this thoroughly, then we won't be as adamant about certain opinions being correct and others being wrong. Okay, so let me explain why. First, just by an introduction of the word itself, because the word hadith, obviously in Arabic, like every other word, it has an etymology, it has an origin. The origin of the word hadith is from hadatha yahduthu, which in the verbal pattern hadatha yahduthu, it literally means for something to come into being. The opposite of something that is qadim. Qadim is something that has existed, all the things that came after it. Whereas hadith would be something that came afterwards. It wasn't there and now it's there. Right? So the word hadatha yahduthu literally means an event also, something that occurred, So the word hadith there comes from that verb. It's a derivative of it. The original meaning of it, as Al-Alamat al-Suyuti rahimahullah ta'ala said, أصله ضد القديم, that the original meaning of hadith is the opposite of qadim. So I mentioned qadim means something that preceded, and hadith then would mean something that came after. So it would be something that is new. This is interesting also that it's something that it came about after something that came before it. It's in other words, in succession, it is not the predecessor, but the one who came after. So there's a hadith that we know that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullu muhdathatin bid'ah," that every single thing that has brought about, that is invented, is a bid'ah, or it is something that was not there and then it came into existence. It's a literal meaning of hadith, that it came into existence after not being there. However, it also is used وَقَدْ اسْتُعْمِلَ فِي قَلِيلِ الْخَبْرِ وَكَثِيرِهِ, that is also used to describe any event, something that occurred. Again, the word hadatha yahduthu also means to occur. So something that happened or an event, whether the description of that event is either of something, it's either a description of event in detail, or maybe not so much. No, I think when something has happened, the description of the event is called hadith. Okay, so that's where the origin of it, this technical term, comes from. There's also kind of a subtle note here that in Surah Al-Duha, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that in regards to the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon you, then you should فَحَدِّثْ. It is the same, it's from the same root as hadith. Hadith means to do tahdith, to speak about or to talk about, described, as it is said also, events that are described either in detail or very briefly are called hadith. So it would mean describe to people the blessings and bounties of Allah upon you. And that would be a hadith, right? Describe, tahdith, hadith, hadith, describe the blessings and bounties of Allah upon you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When you think about this ayah and you think about the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes these blessings in detail. If we go back before that ayah, we see that these blessings are described in detail. أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى, did we not find you as an orphan and we gave you shelter? وَوَجَدَكَ عَائِلًا فَأَغْنَى, and we found you that you were in need, impoverished. In other words, you didn't have much money, much wealth, but we enriched you. And we gave you wealth, and we gave you a better life than what you had experienced before. But also, وَوَجَدَكَ ضَالًا فَهَدَى, and so we also found you that you were without guidance and guided you. Without guidance here means not knowing the commandment of Allah, the shara'i, the detailed commandments of God, which cannot be known simply through the human intellect, but can only be known through wahi, that you did not have that knowledge. Not that the Prophet ﷺ was participating in any of the habits or the shirk of the Jahiliyyah Arab, because that wasn't the case. But he didn't know, right, in detail the commandments of God, and no one can know that obviously throughout wahi, except through wahi. So that was the ni'mah and the blessings Allah told the Prophet ﷺ to describe to people what are those blessings. And if you think deeper about it, those blessings are not just the fact that he was yatim, that he was an orphan, but Allah gave him shelter, or that he did not have a lot of wealth in the beginning of his life, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enriched him and gave him plenty of wealth. Rather, it is a third, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him hidayah, guidance, by giving him a book and by giving him revelation and by giving him guidance through that revelation. So now he has to explain in detail that revelation, which is the greatest blessing of Allah upon him. Just like he has to be careful and treat well the orphan. فَأَمَّا الْيَتِيمَ فَلَا تَقْهَرْ وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ. Just like other orphans he should treat well, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him shelter. And just like people who ask for something, who are in need, he should never turn them down, just like he was in need, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him. So in the same way, when he was given wahi and revelation and knowledge from God, then now he has to explain tahdith, tahdith al-ni'mah. He has to explain in detail what it is that God has blessed him with, which in this case is revelation and guidance. So there, the word hadith would be related to this, that the Prophet ﷺ was entrusted and commanded by Allah Jalla Jalaluhu to explain to detail to people the guidance that had come to him. So that is one of the other explanations of the word hadith. Why is it used when we talk about specifically anything that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ? So when we say that, we mean that anything from an historical vantage, anything that has been attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, or whether it is what he did when he enacted af'alu, wa taqriruhu, or his approvals, meaning things that were done that he became aware of by other people around him, and that he had either he had either spoke about those actions or he remained silent, because that's a type of law giving, approval or silent approval or non-approval of other people's actions. But even more than that, even his details of his conditions, of the way he behaved, of his outward appearance, that is also considered part of hadith. Because anything, anything that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ now becomes studied from an historical point of view of what is called hadith. And that is where the muhaddithun, the scholars of hadith, primarily focus on. In other words, they're focused on hadith from this point of view. Anything that is attributed to the Prophet from an historical perspective, is that attribution acceptable or not? And to a degree also of how acceptable it may be. And that's the important thing to understand, because when we read hadith and we're not really, don't know much about the background of it, or origin of its development of the hadith sciences, and how we understand their veracity and how even we act upon them, what happens is people often get into arguments about this hadith or that hadith and the other. And that is definitely not the purpose of the deen. It's to divide us and to make us argumentative towards one another, especially when we have to understand, first of all, that the whole point of studying hadith is to study it, as I said, from the vantage point of what is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ from historically speaking, and whether that attribution is acceptable or not. And even if it is acceptable, that there are degrees of which, when evidence is provided in anything, that there are degrees of how much that evidence can support a certain opinion or not. And that has to be understood as well. This is where fiqh comes into play, when people have certain rules by which they can derive and give detailed commandments based on hadith. Now, from that perspective, you have to break down hadith also historically in different categories. So, as we spoke about many times, human beings have ways, asbabul ilm, ways where they attain knowledge of things. Amongst those, if you remember any previous classes, is of course khabar. That is, that these are things that we have neither experienced directly, and therefore thereafter drew conclusions, or we have not thought about it, rationalized it, just using pure intellect, okay, and therefore drew conclusions. But these are things that we were told by others, and that's how we know that they existed, okay? So we can answer, yeah, I think, we'll cover that one thing at a time. So the first thing is to know that hadith are, as I mentioned, from an historical vantage point, to study whatever has been attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. And thereafter, the study of those attributions, we have to find out whether, first of all, those attributions are correct or not. And second of all, after that also, we have a certain system where we know that whether that attribution gives us certain knowledge, gives us a or it just gives us, it doesn't give us any certainty whatsoever, and we don't have to act upon it, or we can say straight out that it is a false attribution. So that's important also to understand. The sunnah is a different word. Is literally ada, something that is done habitually or repetitively. Something is done day in and day out. It's also equivalent to a mutaradif. It is a synonym of sirah, something that of the way and the habit of a person. So the sunnah literally is much broader than hadith, because the sunnah is a practice that is established within the deen and becomes part of the deen, and is not only based on just an hadith. And we can get to some examples of that later on. That's very important. That is established to be a practice of the Prophet ﷺ, and according to some too, not just a practice of the Prophet alone ﷺ, but also a practice of the Sahaba. Okay, or also al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, or the four early caliphs. That is also part of what people would term as the Sunnah. Right? This is the general practice of the community based on certain things like hadith. It doesn't always have to be hadith. And to give an example, there can be single narrations of hadith that are exclusive, and they don't account to be part of a sunnah for many different reasons. Perhaps it's something that the Prophet ﷺ only did once. Perhaps it's something that the Prophet ﷺ it was only for him and not for others. And there's a lot of reasons. And that's like the detailed part of the sciences of hadith and fiqh, that this is why sometimes we don't always come to the same conclusions. But you have to understand that first to make sure that you don't find any problems with people having a difference of opinion. So going back to the idea of hadith as being anything that is attributed from a historical vantage point to the Prophet ﷺ, like any other historical attribution, which is called khabar, and that is how we derive certain types of knowledge of things. Like I said before, we don't experience directly, not through empirical knowledge, nor can we just rationalize it either. But it is something we know, strictly speaking, through historical reports. Like most of the history that we know, and some of history is questionable, but there are many historical facts that we know they're exactly as I named them, facts. Why? Because the information that is related to us has come to us in such abundance that no one would ever imagine that it is a lie. In fact, we know for certain that these things occurred because of the number of narrations. So that's one type of attribution of an event. And this is what the scholars of hadith called something that is mutawatir. So a hadith that is mutawatir means that an event that is related to us, because they literally say the amr hissi, something that actually occurred, which means it was a visible, tangible event. As an example, Rasulullah ﷺ existed and he read the Quran. These are tangible things. It is a person, and the Quran is something that when he read it, other people could hear, and they physically wrote it down, and so forth and so on. All of that are very tangible things. These are not just theoretical. They're very tangible. They are events that occurred, and it could be seen or heard, so forth and so on. In other words, hissi means through the five senses, someone could have witnessed or heard, so forth and so on, what exactly happened. So people witnessed Muhammad ﷺ, and they heard the Quran. Okay, you got it? Thereafter, if that event is narrated by so many people, it was witnessed by so many people that there is no doubt in any person's mind that, for instance, Muhammad ﷺ was a historical figure who existed, and the Quran is what he gave to people. That is something even a non-Muslim couldn't deny, based alone on this such large number of historical reports that would not give room for anyone to have any doubt about that. That's an example, for instance, of what could be construed as mutawatir. So some hadith, meaning some things that are attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, are considered mutawatir. Now, if that's the case, there are certain events or certain things or certain statements that are attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that are considered mutawatir, okay? Then that would mean that we are certain, from an historical perspective, we are certain that this is something that the Prophet ﷺ did or said, so forth and so on. Oddly enough, that one of the examples of a hadith in terms of one of the Prophet's statements, and that's why they also say that hadith can be divided in different aspects, and one of the two is something that is qawli, meaning is a literal verbal statement of the Prophet ﷺ. One of those verbal statements that is attributed to him that is considered mutawatir is man kadhiba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu minan nar. That whoever will lie about me or attribute some lie to me deliberately, whoever will attribute a falsehood to me deliberately, so let them prepare their own seat in the hellfire. This is one of the things that it was attributed to the Prophet ﷺ as have been said by him, that is mutawatir, that we are certain that he did say that. And what is it? Whoever will deliberately attribute a false statement to me or lie about something that I have did or said, so forth and so on, and attribute something to me falsely, then let them prepare their own seat in the hellfire. This is a very stern warning. But that is an example of something that scholars have said that this is what so many people have narrated this particular statement of the Prophet ﷺ, that we know it for certain. The point that we say it gives us yaqeen, that's important, is because when something is mutawatir and it gives us yaqeen, then its status does not become just simply a sunnah. Okay, these things that are mutawatir become, first of all, an obligation for us to believe in, and a point of etiquette that is in our creed. It is something the person must believe. If they deny it, it is equivalent to kufr, because kufr here would mean a denial of a fact. Okay? It is something that we know for certain that the Prophet said or did, so forth and so on. So to deny it would be equivalent to denying a fact, or an absolute fact. So that is also considered kufr. From an action point of view, meaning what kind of law can it derive? It's the same thing. Something that is mutawatir, it establishes facts. So a lot of things can be commandments like halal and haram, and those things which usually we need the highest type of evidence for. They also will give us that type of knowledge. Now, what's important to understand about a lot of hadith is that most of the hadith that we see in hadith compilations, whether it's the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, the Sahih of Imam Muslim, and all the other books of hadith that we commonly know, the Sunan of Imam Tirmidhi, the Sunan of Abi Dawood, the Sunan of Ibn Majah, and so forth and so on. Those are more commonly known by people, the Sunan of Imam Nasa'i. The majority of those hadith are not considered mutawatir. Okay. The majority of the hadith in these books are not considered mutawatir. They will be under the category of what we call khabar al-wahid, meaning that for the most part, these are single narrations. By single, we mean that maybe one person has narrated it from the beginning, meaning after the Prophet ﷺ, we may have one narrator, and sometimes more. They have different names for these categories too. Sometimes there may be three narrators from amongst the companions, right? From amongst the Sahaba with one of Allah. Sometimes there are three, sometimes four. If they don't reach such a number that gives us certainty, which is mutawatir, then we will call it khabar wahid. So it doesn't always have to be just one narrator. It can be two or three, but it doesn't still give us that type of certainty as something that is mutawatir, such a large number where which a person or a people would be certain that that was definitely said or done by the Prophet ﷺ. Now, why is that important? Is because it's when we have such few narrators that it's important to examine that narration from two perspectives. One is from the actual narrators themselves, that whether we can rely on them or not, and the other is the actual text itself, that the actual wording of what is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, or even an action of the Prophet, that what was being said, okay, that is also examined. So those are the two aspects by which the scholars will examine these hadith, and thereafter grade them to be sahih, hasan, or da'if. Either it is sound, meaning that it is acceptable as an historical narration or attribution to the Prophet ﷺ. Because it's acceptable, yujib al-amal, that it does necessitate that we should act upon it. But it's not the same as mutawatir, is that it does not give us, how should I put it? It doesn't give us complete conviction. It gives us, it's like overwhelming evidence. And when overwhelming evidence is presented, for instance, in a court, it doesn't necessarily mean that there might not be a mistake or error or other considerations. I don't even want to say mistake or error, but let's say other considerations that perhaps there's still room for some doubt. Okay? Still room for some doubt. I like to give it a simple example just because I think it works, but it's to give an example between the differences of these things between mutawatir and what is khabar wahid and then sahih and hasan and da'if is it's basically like this. You may have someone well who you trust and they don't lie and they have no reason to lie to you. They come to you and they say that, for instance, your car has been stolen. It's one person. Keep that in mind. They come and they say your car has been stolen. So before you actually call the police or whoever you want to call 911, report your car stolen, you might actually go outside and check to see whether that's true. Not because you have any doubt in the person themselves, because you know them well and you know they're honest, but because they may have made some error somehow in some way. Maybe they thought it was your car, but it really wasn't. It was somebody else's car that was maybe the same model, just as an example. So you double check just to make sure, right? You double check. There could be room for error. Whereas if 6 different people or 7 different people tell you the same thing, like one after the other comes in and says that your car is stolen, your car has been stolen, your car has been stolen, right? Then you're not even going to bother checking because there's no reason that many different people would tell you a lie like that, right? If that makes sense. Okay, so it is a fact that when we accept secondary reports of things that we didn't witness or we cannot rationalize, then the more people who have witnessed it, the more we are sure of it happening. Whereas if one person witnesses it, albeit no matter how reliable they are, we still have somewhat of a, I don't want to say doubt, but there should be something in our hearts that tells us that we need to verify still. Not because we don't trust them, but before we do anything definitively, we have to make sure that that report or that narration is that they didn't make any human error. Not because we believe they lied. And that's the important distinction here. However, of course, for the people who heard it from the Prophet ﷺ, then it becomes definitive. Anything that the Prophet ﷺ says is true. So for the people who hear it directly, there's no question of it, that whether they should act upon it or not. The only question is the people who come after that generation, who did not see the Prophet ﷺ or not there to witness him. They are the ones who have to now verify these different reports and attributions and make sure where they fit in. First of all, even in these categories, just from that vantage point, the strength of how many narrators are there, and then if not enough narrators there to give us that yaqeen, that certainly which is mutawatir, then we have to study the hadith, like I said, from 2 vantage points: the narrators themselves, and then the actual text of the hadith. After all that, we can grade the hadith sahih, which is acceptable, it is strong, and we should act upon it. Hasan, which is acceptable enough to use as some type of evidence. Hasan is considered the literal definition of qabl al-ihtijaj, meaning that if it's acceptable to that point, it's Hasan, we can still use it to prove a point, or still prove it to say that the Prophet ﷺ had said something like this or done something like this. It should have some value in throwing some weight into a particular argument, okay, that whether we should do something or not. And this is very important because in terms of etiquette, there is a difference in our beliefs and those things that we say make us Muslim. Then all evidence that we use in that field has to be yaqeeniyya, as they say. It has to be definitive, it has to be certain. All right. Whereas in action, in the a'mal, meaning the things that we do like this, dua after salah, or making dua and raising our hands in the adab of dua, this is not of, it's not in the category of those things which we have in our creed and our etiquette. Therefore, they do not have to meet the same stringent type of, it doesn't have to be yaqeeniyya. It doesn't have to be certain and absolute now. You can act upon something that, as an example, something is hasan, that is acceptable enough from the vantage point of both the narrators and the actual text. It's acceptable enough for us to actually act upon, or to prove a point that we should do something a certain way. Okay? Whereas da'if is something that it doesn't really prove any point, and you cannot use it to prove any point. However, there's a difference of opinion amongst ulama whether you can actually use them to do things that are already proven. What does that mean? For instance, if a certain hadith mentions that there's reward for reading the Quran, and it happens to be da'if, and it mentions a certain amount of reward, the idea is that reading the Quran, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, to read the Quran is already part of our deen. It is part of the things that we are commanded to do, and it is part of the things that the Prophet ﷺ and all the companions and every Muslim has done since his time until now. It's established as a fact. So if there's a hadith that's da'if or weak that gives us some type of motivation to do it, we won't necessarily throw it out simply because it is motivating us to something that is already known or established in the deen. Okay? So as an example, if we understand that there's a hadith that I mentioned by Umar ibn Khattab anhu, and this is in the Sunnah of Imam and the Sunnah of Imam al-Tirmidhi. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا رفع يديه في الدعاء لم يردهما حتى يسمح بهما وجهه. That here in this hadith, Umar ibn Khattab narrated that when the Prophet ﷺ it indicates that this was the habit of the Prophet ﷺ. If you would say it like a sunnah. Okay, but before we establish again sunnah, we have to look first in certain details of the hadith itself and other things. So we would say it's from the adab, actually, from the etiquette of dua, based on this hadith or others. But anyhow, he said, Kana Rasulullah, which means this was his habit, that when he used to raise his hands in dua, which established, first of all, that when he made dua, normally his habit was to raise his hand. Lam yarudahuma, he would not take them down until حتى يمسح بهما, he had wiped his face with them. So the dua here, as he said, that the Prophet used to make dua raising his hands, and he would not bring them down until he had wiped his face with them. This is in the Sunnah of Imam al-Tirmidhi. Now Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani said that this hadith is hasan, based on other narrations. What does that mean again? Qabil al-ihtijaj. It means that it's not as strong as Sahih, which if we know something is sound in Sahih, we should act upon it without question. Here, hasan would mean that it's something that is acceptable enough for us to prove a point, to make a point, and to say that this is something that the Prophet ﷺ did, or something that the Prophet ﷺ said, to that extent that we can make some argument. In this case, the argument to be made here is that when you make dua, the adab of dua is to raise your hands, and then when you're done, you should wipe your face. Okay, this is not the only narration, obviously. Ibn Abbas anhuma has been narrated to have said in the Sunan of Ibn Majah the same thing, that Rasulullah that the Prophet said that when you are done making dua, then you should wipe your face with both of your hands, which is interesting because in this narration, which is an authority, there's two companions now, right? This is on the authority of Abdullah ibn Abbas. In this narration, it is not a action of the Prophet being reported to us, but it is rather a command. This is the command form. إِذَا فَرَغْتَ مِنَ الدُّعَاءِ فَامْسَحْ بِيَدَيْكَ وَجْهَكَ. It is a little command form. That too is taken into consideration when we study these things. That, for instance, that the Prophet commands something as opposed to doing something. Here we have both his action and his commandment to do so. That if you make dua, then when you're done making dua, wipe your face. All those things are taken into consideration by the scholars. And in addition to the actual historical narration of the hadith itself, that is this reliable? Are there other reasons why we can support this hadith It's called shawahid. There's different narrators. As in this case, we notice Umar ibn al-Khattab narrated this hadith. And then in the Sunan of Ibn Majah, also Abdullah ibn Abbas narrated this hadith. So these are supporting, corroborating evidences that are there to again give support to an idea as being something that is Islamic or something that is attributed to the Prophet. All of that is done through great and meticulous effort by the scholars. And if they differ sometimes about these issues, it's only because knowing the difference between how narrations can give us certainty and not, that it's only going to be natural that at certain times narrations that are not give us that type of certainty as mutawatir. Going to be some difference because at the end of the day, these scholarly efforts are based on human endeavor. Okay, mistakes may be made, and mistakes can be made and will be made at times. But if they are educated guesses, and it's not going to do anything to our deen directly, because we're talking about things like making dua. All right, these are not in any way going to affect the actual essence of dua, which is supplication to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then it's not really shouldn't be something in our minds that makes much of a difference, that people should be upset whether you do it without raising your hands or raising your hands or doing it after salah, as this hadith I mentioned before said, that this is the dua that is heard the most by Allah. Ayu dua asma, that this dua is heard most by Allah too. Jawf al-layl al-akhiri, in the middle of the night, wa dubur as-salawat al-maktubat, and at the end of every fard salah. So, inshallah, we can stop here and open up for some questions. I just wanted to introduce very briefly and very simply the idea of hadith and what it is in hadith sciences. If some people find that interesting, it's always, my invitation that we can even open up another class for that subject, that to go into more detail about this hadith terminology, hadith sciences, the hadith, the history of hadith, and compilation of hadith as much as we can, and then even some examples of how hadith are graded, and then afterwards, looking at that, how the differences of these things sometimes affect Islamic law, and especially with things like this. But important to remember too, when we say law, as I said, these two hadith, the hadith of Umar and the hadith of Abdullah ibn Abbas, at a level they're considered hasan. But at that level too, they are qabil al-ihtijaj. They are acceptable enough to make certain points. And that's why many ulama will say that to do these things, meaning what is mentioned in this hadith, okay, إذا رفع يديه في الدعاء لم يردهما حتى يمسح بهما وجهه. To raise your hands and then wipe your face, and all of this that's mentioned in this hadith and the other hadith that I mentioned of Abdullah ibn Abbas will be considered adab, because of the gradation of most scholars of it being hasan. Okay. Yeah, that's a point of contention. Again, that's a scholarly debate. And the Hanafi school of thought, it's not permissible to say anything in the prayer outside of the Arabic language. Okay. There may be other people who don't agree with that, but that is their opinion, is that anything that is in the salah, when we say prayer, of course, we mean specifically anything that is in the salah, whether they are the fara'id or the sunan or nawafil, no matter what category, if they're the obligatory or the sunan or nawafil, that all of the prayers in the salah and the du'as in the salah should be in the Arabic language. And wallahu ta'ala alim. So also that's a request. If some people are interested in opening up that as a class, I would be willing to do that as well. That maybe we can talk somewhat about hadith, usul hadith, like the sciences of hadith, the terminology of hadith, and that may give us some. I believe that the more knowledge you have, the better it is for us to to develop a certain understanding amongst each other when we have these differences, and not be so adamant about them, right? Because you appreciate the difference between certain types of evidences, that some evidences are no doubt, they have to be accepted, and they have to be accepted at face value, but we have to first determine that. And a lot of the differences of opinions that we find are because those evidences are not of that type. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the things that we have differences of opinion of are based on things that are khabar wahid, that even from an historical point of view, it is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, but they don't give us absolute certainty. They give us overwhelming evidence that yes, certain things did happen, or the Prophet did say, ﷺ, but they cannot be without other corroborating evidence to understand them. Whereas something that's mutawatir, again, something that is established by at that level, is to us a fact. Just from, it's a fact that we don't argue with it. Most of the differences, as I say again, you will find most of the time are based on khabar wahid. And the reason why that's important is because no one can think they know for certain that they're absolutely right, as opposed to something that is mutawatir. Then it's like, again, it's a fact. It is what it is. Any questions? Any more questions?
Yeah, I don't see any question in the chat window, but I'm gonna unmute everyone so everyone will get a chance to speak up. And if you don't want to speak up, just please mute yourself. So I'm gonna unmute everyone. All right, now you are all unmuted, and go ahead, ask the question if you have any questions.
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Loud and clear, mashallah.
Okay, so this is Umar Sultan, and just a question on the comment that you made toward the end about the Hanafi, the Hanafi way of looking at the salat, not to inject anything but the structure of the salat, which is the niyyah, and then for that by the Surah Fatiha and so forth. But that is not, that is only confined to the salat itself, right? And
yes,
it does not apply to the dua after the salat that every worshipper makes, for himself and for others. That can be done in a native language or a language other than the language of the Quran or the classical Arabic language.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Yes, that's correct. So the reason why they restrict salat is because, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." Pray as you see me pray. So there's a restriction there, correct? So the Prophet ﷺ is saying, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." Pray as you see me pray. So that it's very restricted. There's no room given there for us to do as we please. But the Prophet ﷺ is commanding us to do exactly what he does in salah. Excuse me. But dua can be made in any language. Of course, it is better to make du'as from the Sunnah just because the Prophet ﷺ, his words are inspired. But there are times, like the ulama say, that du'a in your own language is more effective because it's more heartfelt. Okay? So when you're making du'a in your own mother tongue, you're obviously going to be able to express yourself better than in a foreign language. So du'a outside of salah is definitely something that can be done in any language. And sometimes even some suggest it may be better that you make it in your own language because it's, again, as I said, it's more heartfelt. It's more from the heart than it would be if you recited it in a language you don't necessarily understand.
Okay. Yes, inshallah, you've answered my concern and question. Thank you so much.
Alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah.
Alhamdulillah.
Thanks, Brother Umar, for asking question. Anyone else has any questions?
I have a question for you, Amjad.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so I understand that.
I mean, if it's not related to this lecture, we can take it offline. This is more like, you're asking question to Brother Dickinson.
Okay. I will ask offline then.
Yeah, ping me, Okay.
Okay.
Anyone? Yeah. Anyone else has any questions for Brother Dickinson regarding this Quran lecture?
Okay. So the schedule for the next lecture is Sunday.
Yes, Sunday. Yes.
And all we do is, are you going to be sending out another link, or?
Yeah, I'll
we will
send
use
another
this?
link. Yeah, that's what I do. And let's connect offline. I can tell you the details. I can add you into the group as well, in the Quran group.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, let me know if you can get some feedback from other people if they feel like they want to do some more do some more classes about Usul Hadith or the principles of Hadith sciences. We'd be happy. Otherwise, we can just go further and with the du'as and some reflections of different du'as of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Okay, inshallah. I'll ask the community and get the feedback, inshallah.
Okay. Inshallah.
Yeah, okay. I don't think so. Anyone has any questions now? So I'm gonna end the meeting. Thank you so much for everyone for joining, and